On a sunny spring morning, April 16, 1945, a strange sight unfolded on the road leading out of Weimar, Germany. It was not a column of soldiers, but a parade of the region's most prominent citizens. Men wore expensive suits and fedoras, women were draped in fur coats, their lips painted bright red, walking in elegant high heels. They chatted, smiled, and even laughed, as if they were on their way to an opera performance or an elite garden party. But in reality, they were moving at gunpoint. Escorting them were American soldiers from General Patton's Third Army. In stark contrast to the relaxed demeanor of the German civilians, the American GIs were grim and covered in grime, their fingers resting on the triggers of their M1 Garands. They were marching these 1,000 elite citizens 5 miles up Ettersberg Hill, toward a place that every single one of them swore they knew nothing about, the Buchenwald concentration camp. The world knew Weimar not as a mere coordinate on a military map, but as a cathedral of the German soul. If Berlin was the center of power and steel, then Weimar was the breath of poetry and music. This was the city of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, whose verses moved all of Europe, the place where Friedrich Schiller dreamed of freedom, and the cradle of the Bauhaus, which shaped the beauty of modern architecture. In the 1940s, the residents of Weimar still carried the pride of cultural heirs. Inside ancient domed villas, they sat over bone china cups of coffee, discussing Beethoven's symphonies or Kant's abstract philosophy. For them, civilization was not just a concept, it was a polished suit of armor that shielded them from the brutality of the outside world. Yet, just behind that armor, less than 5 miles as the crow flies from the vibrant flower gardens and luxurious theaters, another reality was silently operating. It was Ettersberg Hill, where the darkness was so thick that the light of every great thinker could not penetrate it. The death factory at the foot of a poetic hill. From 1937, when the Buchenwald concentration camp was erected, a sickening symbiosis began. While the ladies of Weimar shopped for the finest silks, the SS officers running the camp were regular patrons of the same restaurants and bakeries. They lived in beautiful suburban villas and returned to the city in the evenings to enjoy classical music, the scent of the crematoria still clinging to their shoulders. For 8 long years, the sky over Weimar was no longer as clear and blue as it had been in Goethe's time. Instead, it was filled with a thick, acrid gray smoke carrying the stench of burning organic matter. That ash floated over precious libraries, settled into afternoon teacups, and clung to white-painted window frames. Yet, the citizens of Weimar engaged in what history would later call systematic blindness. They saw the trains filled with people as thin as ghosts passing through the city station, but told one another they were the volunteers going to work. They smelled the heavy scent of death, but nodded in agreement that it was the smell of a factory producing war materials. This lie was repeated so often that it became an accepted truth, an invisible wall separating cultural pride from moral rot. When the play ended, the wrath of old blood and guts. On April 11, 1945, as the tanks of the U.S. Third Army crushed the barbed wire fences, Weimar's perfect play began to fracture. When General George S. Patton stepped through the gates of Buchenwald a few days later, a man who had survived hundreds of battles and witnessed death in its most brutal form stood frozen. Before him was not a battlefield, but an industrial-scale slaughterhouse. Piles of naked, skeletal corpses were stacked like cords of wood waiting to be lit. The crematoria still radiated a lingering heat, containing fragments of bone that had not yet turned to ash. The stench of decay, disease, and primal evil was so overpowering that young American soldiers, who had fought bravely just the day before, were forced to lean against trees and vomit in bitterness. Patton walked between the rows of foul-smelling barracks where living souls were reduced to withered skeletons, their gazes so hollow they lacked the strength to even celebrate their liberation. A vein throbbed in the old general's forehead. He turned to look at the beautiful city of Weimar resting peacefully at the foot of the hill, where citizens were nonchalantly doing laundry and farming as if this hell did not exist. They say they didn't know. Patton roared, his voice hoarse with fury. How could they not know when the smoke from these chimneys blew directly into their windows every day? How could they not know when they sold bread with their own hands to these butchers? In Patton's eyes, Weimar's silence was not ignorance, it was a crime of complicity. Their sophistication, education, and love for art were now a disgusting irony. They had used Beethoven to drown out the screams of the tortured, they had used philosophy to justify their own indifference. The graded order, the march of shame. Patton would accept no excuses. He ordered the military police to execute an unprecedented mission: go into the city. Do not arrest the guards, arrest the civilians. I want the wealthiest, the most educated, those who consider themselves the most refined. Bring them up here. And so, a surreal parade took place. 1,000 of Weimar's most elite citizens, dressed in their finest attire, were marched up Ettersburg Hill. They walked between two lines of American soldiers holding rifles with glares of pure contempt. At first, they maintained an air of arrogance, whispering that this was merely a political setup to smear German honor. They covered their noses with expensive perfume-scented silk handkerchiefs, trying to protect their aristocratic senses from the thickening stench. But as they stepped through the gates of Buchenwald, every mask shattered. Patton ordered his soldiers, don't let them look away. If they turn their heads, grab their chins and force them to look. Rub their noses in this disgusting filth, because this is the history they helped write with their silence. Under that ruthless escort, the elite of Weimar were forced to face their true masterpiece. They saw the stacks of bodies, the lampshades made of tattooed human skin, and children huddled in the mud. Piercing screams began to erupt from the same ladies who had just been complaining about the road dust. Refined men collapsed, vomiting onto their own polished leather shoes. The play of innocence had officially ended in bitterness. Weimar, the heart of German culture, now had to look into the mirror of Buchenwald and realize that behind the brilliant shell of civilization was a soul rotted by indifference. Wir hatten keine Ahnung, we had no idea. That lie died on Ettersburg Hill that afternoon, under the fiery gaze of General Patton and the haunting silence of thousands of corpses. History records that after that trip, the pride of Weimar could never truly stand tall again. For, as Patton proved, when culture does not go hand in hand with conscience, it is merely a magnificent mask on the face of a devil. The journey began not with tears, but in an atmosphere of resentment and disdain. By General Patton's order, 1,000 of Weimar's most elite citizens, professors, doctors, bankers, and aristocratic ladies, were herded out of their cozy homes. Under the brilliant golden sun of a spring morning in 1945, the group looked like a party of high society tourists embarking on a forced excursion. Ladies in luxurious fur coats, clutching silk purses, lifted their hems high to avoid the dust of the Ettersburg road. Complaints rippled through the crowd. One woman, her face meticulously powdered, snapped at a U.S. military policeman, "This is ridiculous. Do you have any idea these shoes had to be custom ordered from France? This dust will ruin them." The men beside her whispered about how the Americans were wasting their time with a cheap propaganda stunt. They laughed, the smug smile of those who believed they belonged to a layer of civilization that was untouchable. But this 2-hour march was not as simple as they imagined. A wind from the abyss. As the group began to climb the higher slopes of Ettersburg Hill, the terrain turned rugged and the atmosphere shifted in a grotesque way. The ancient oak trees, once the pride of the land beloved by the poet Goethe, seemed to twist in a silent agony. The laughter died away. The idle chatter about music and philosophy was replaced by the sound of heavy, labored breathing. And then, the wind shifted. It was not a breeze carrying the breath of spring or the scent of forest flowers. A thick, greasy, heavy wave of air collapsed down from the hilltop. It carried the stench of 1,000 days of decay, the smell of scorched flesh, and the scent of infectious diseases rooted in the dark mud. That stench didn't just pass through the nose, it invaded the esophagus and clung to the throat, forcing those at the front to stumble and gag. Embroidered handkerchiefs, soaked in the most expensive perfumes from Weimar, were hastily pulled out. They pressed them tightly to their noses, hoping the scent of lavender or rose could block out the rushing truth. But the American soldiers, with stone-cold faces and garrons at the ready, brushed aside every attempt to hide. A young soldier growled, "Put the rags down. Breathe the air you've been creating for 8 years. Keep moving." At the foot of the merciless iron gate. Finally, the summit appeared. Looming before them was a tangled mess of barbed wire, stretching to the horizon like the fangs of a giant beast. And at the center stood the pitch-black iron gate of Buchenwald. Upon that gate, intricately forged iron letters appeared, Jedem das Same, to each what they deserve. A philosophical maxim that originally spoke of justice was now placed at the entrance to hell as a cruel mockery of humanity. As the people of Weimar stepped through that gate, their world officially collapsed. The spring sunlight seemed unable to penetrate the barbed wire. Inside, there was only the gray of ash and the black of sodden mud. The velvet slippers and polished leather shoes of the elite sank deep into the slush, a mixture of soil, rainwater, and human bone ash. The earlier complaints about road dust now became a nauseating irony. They no longer worried about their shoes, for before them was a sight that no page of Goethe could ever describe. The silence of the skeletons. The crowd was greeted not by screams of hatred, but by a deathly silence. Thousands of prisoners, or rather, living skeletons, stood lined along the path. They wore ragged, filthy blue and white striped uniforms. Their skin was stretched tight over bone, their eyes sunken into their sockets, unnaturally large and hollow. They did not attack, they did not hurl curses. They simply stood there, motionless as statues carved from pain. Thousands of those eyes fell simultaneously upon the people of Weimar. They stared at the aristocratic fur coats, the expensive fedoras, and the faces flushed from being well-fed and warm. That gaze did not hold an explosion of rage, but the weight of eternal judgment. It was like a mirror reflecting directly into the souls of the Weimar citizens, stripping away every lie about not knowing. One Weimar lady, unable to bear the gaze of a young prisoner, whose arms were so thin they looked like dry kindling, screamed and covered her face. Immediately, an American officer stepped forward, seized her wrist, and yanked it down. "Look. They saw you every day from behind that fence. Now it's your turn to look at them." The contrast between the two worlds in that moment was devastating. On one side, the pinnacle of material and cultural indulgence, on the other, the deepest pit of human degradation. The expensive suits suddenly looked ridiculous and grotesque in a space filled with the scent of death. Every step the people of Weimar took on the mud of Buchenwald felt as heavy as if they were wearing lead. They realized a terrifying thing: the volunteers they had spoken of were, in fact, unburied corpses. The factories they had praised were, in fact, places where human flesh was roasted. And their long-standing silence was the blade that had cut off the breath of tens of thousands of people. The gates of hell had opened, and though they would eventually walk out, the souls of the Weimar citizens would forever be imprisoned in the silent gaze of the skeletons of Buchenwald. The march of shame was only truly beginning as they were led deeper into the heart of the camp, where the crematoria were still dripping the last drops of human fat. The people of Weimar stepped deeper into the heart of Buchenwald, each step sinking them further into the mire of the crimes they had so long denied. The radiant spring sunlight outside the barbed wire seemed unable to penetrate this place. The air was thick with the gray hue of ash and the cold breath of death. The pride of these professors, doctors, and noble ladies was now a fragile shell, trembling before what was about to be revealed. Silent screams on a trailer. The first stop was the crematorium area. Here, the U.S. Army had intentionally left the scene exactly as it was when they took over the camp. A large trailer sat in the middle of the yard, but it was not loaded with wood or supplies. It held a mountain of humanity, dozens of naked, skeletal corpses piled on top of one another like broken dolls tossed into a landfill. Death here held no dignity. Teeth were bared and hollow sockets stared wide, as if looking directly into the souls of those passing by. Their limbs were tangled and twisted together in a final, desperate effort to find warmth or life. It was the most horrific, silent scream humanity had ever created. A Weimar lady, who until now had tried to maintain her elegance with a silk handkerchief, could endure no more. When she saw the body of a child wedged between adult corpses, she let out a soul-shattering cry and collapsed into the slushy mud. Her expensive velvet shoes and luxurious fur coat were now soaked in the death-laden filth. She sobbed uncontrollably, covering her face with both hands to escape reality. But compassion did not exist in Buchenwald that day. A U.S. military policeman stepped forward, his face as hard as carved stone. He did not reach out to help, nor did he offer a word of comfort. Instead, he used the toe of his boot to nudge her shoulder, his voice cold and steely, "Get up. Don't waste your tears here. Stand up and look closely, because you haven't even seen the worst of it yet." The pathology lab, when humans became materials. The group was herded into a gray brick building, a place known by the euphemistic name, the pathology laboratory. Inside, on clean wooden tables, the U.S. Army had displayed items found in the storage rooms of the SS officers. The entire room fell deathly silent, save for the sounds of gasping and stifled sobs. On the tables sat two shrunken heads, preserved using the techniques of primitive tribes. The hair and features of the ill-fated Polish prisoners remained intact in a grotesque form. But what shocked the citizens of Weimar most were the pieces of human skin. These were patches of chest and back skin featuring artistic tattoos, flayed from prisoners to satisfy the morbid whims of Ilse Koch, the camp commander's wife. Some pieces had been tanned and sewn into lampshades, book covers, or wallets. The household items that the Weimar elite used every day were now presented here, crafted from the flesh of their fellow human beings. A U.S. officer stepped into the center of the room. He looked directly at the trembling professors and intellectuals, then growled in perfect German, his voice terrifyingly clear, "You say you didn't know? You say this was the fault of the government, of the army? Look at these things. They were manufactured right in your own backyard. While you leisurely sipped coffee on Goethe Street, while you debated the greatness of man in your theaters, right here, they were skinning your fellow men to make handicrafts. Where does your civilization sit upon these lampshades?" The Weimar men, once so proud of their architecture and art, bowed their heads, some turned away to vomit on the spot. The wall of denial had completely crumbled. Their sophistication, it turned out, was merely a veil covering the ultimate rot of their humanity. Facing the living witness. As the group moved toward the quarantine area, where prisoners with infectious diseases were left to die, they encountered a group of survivors. Among them, a gaunt man with eyes burning with a melancholy fire stepped out to block the path of a dapper gentleman, a well-known banker from Weimar. The prisoner raised a skeletal finger, trembling with weakness but heavy with significance, and pointed it directly at the banker's chest. His voice was a faint rasp, yet it echoed as if from the grave, "I remember you. Don't you remember me? I was the one hauling crates at the Weimar train station every morning. I saw you walk past with your walking stick and your gray fedora. Many times, our eyes met while I was being beaten by guards right there on the platform. You saw the blood on my shirt, you saw my ribs through my rags. But what did you do? You adjusted your collar and turned your face away as if I were a pile of filth ruining your fine morning." The banker stood frozen. Every excuse about collective responsibility or personal fear choked in his throat. He looked into the eyes of the prisoner, a living witness to his own cowardice. The truth was no longer numbers in a newspaper or distant smoke on a hilltop, the truth stood right in front of him, in the form of a man he had once deemed invisible. The nobleman of Weimar collapsed completely. He fell to his knees in the mud, clutching his head and sobbing like a child. These were not just tears of fear at the mouth of American guns, but the shattering of a false value system. Even he could no longer believe the lies he had used to comfort his conscience for 8 years. The journey through Buchenwald ended in a heavy, somber silence. The 1,000 citizens of Weimar walked out of the iron gates, but they were no longer the people who had marched up the hill that morning. They descended with slumped shoulders and hollow stares, carrying the ghosts of the corpses and the silent screams back to their beautiful homes. General Patton had succeeded. He hadn't just shown them a concentration camp, he had forced them to look into the abyss within their own souls, the place where silence and indifference had aided the devil. Buchenwald was no longer just a geographical name, it had become a permanent scar on the conscience of an entire generation of the German elite. On the afternoon of April 16, 1945, the sun began to slip behind the oak ridges of Ettersberg Hill, but the warmth of spring seemed to have permanently abandoned the crowd trudging downward. The 1,000 citizens of Weimar walked in absolute silence, a silence so thick and heavy it weighed more than the roar of artillery at the front. They descended the hill no longer appearing as proud aristocrats. Their expensive suits were now wrinkled, coated in dust and bone ash, their luxurious fur coats were stained by the foul mud of the concentration camp. The makeup on the ladies' faces was smeared by tears and sweat, revealing aged faces pale with horror. The smug smiles and the disdain for the American theatrical stunt had vanished without a trace. In their place were glazed eyes, staring into a hollow void. Weimar still lay there, beautiful and ancient at the foot of the hill. But for these 1,000 people, the city was no longer a paradise. From this moment on, whenever they stood at their villa windows or strolled through the park, if they so much as glanced up at the lush greenery atop Ettersberg, they would no longer see the beauty of nature or the inspiration of poetry. They would see only black columns of smoke, piles of naked corpses, and the piercing glares of walking skeletons. Hell was no longer a distant place, it had followed them back to their very doorsteps. Eisenhower's vision, the war against oblivion. When news of General Patton's forced tour reached the ears of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower, he did not issue a single word of reprimand for this somewhat unmilitary act. On the contrary, Eisenhower, a man of cold logic and strategic vision, immediately recognized its devastating historical value. Eisenhower knew that human memory is the most easily distorted of things. He understood deeply that once the guns fell silent, the world would want to forget the most painful truths. There would be those who would stand up and claim the crematoria were fake, the corpses were staged, and that the great German nation could never have had a hand in such devilry. He immediately sent an urgent cable to Washington and London with a fierce message: send the press here. Send the congressmen, the editors, the historians. We must gather the evidence now, because one day, some son of a bitch will stand up and say this never happened. Eisenhower replicated Patton's order across all liberated territories. He forced local officials, civilians, and even surrendered German soldiers to walk through the concentration camps. He wanted to turn those who had condoned the crimes into undeniable living witnesses. They were forced to see, to smell, and to touch the truth so that history could not be rewritten with lies. A white night in Weimar, when the mirror becomes a blade. That night, the city of Weimar was submerged in an atmosphere of chilling gloom. Houses that once rang with the music of Beethoven were now as silent as tombs. The citizens who returned from Ettersberg locked themselves in private rooms. For some, the truth was a dose too potent for the mind to assimilate. Inside the luxurious villas, the veneer of civilization had shattered. As they stood before mirrors to wash away the mud of Buchenwald, they did not see the face of a scholar or a refined lady, they saw the image of an accomplice to the devil. Why had they said nothing when the trains roared in the night? Why had they not asked about the acrid stench drifting into their bedrooms? The answer, "We didn't know," now sounded like a curse rising from the depths of hell. In the darkness of that night, many elite citizens, those who had stood at the apex of Weimar society, chose the most extreme way to end their shame. Poison, ropes, and pistol shots rang out in the silence. They committed suicide not out of fear of being tried by the Americans, but because they could not bear to live with themselves. They realized that their profound education and refined aesthetic tastes had utterly failed to keep them human. The truth in the mirror had become the sharpest blade, severing the last shred of their self-respect. An eternal warning, the crime of indifference. The story of Buchenwald and the March of Shame is not just a dark chapter in war history. It is a ruthless examination of human nature. It strips bare a terrifying truth: evil does not require everyone to carry a gun, it only needs the majority of people to choose to look away. The citizens of Weimar did not directly turn the gas valves, they did not beat prisoners with clubs, and they did not sign execution orders. They simply lived ordinary lives, tending gardens, enjoying the arts, and pretending nothing was happening on the other side of the hill. But that very ordinariness was the nutrient that allowed evil to grow. Every cup of coffee they drank in tranquility was a silent consensus for a life being burned on Ettersburg. General Patton, through his abrasive yet justice-driven style, left an eternal lesson for humanity: you cannot claim innocence just because you closed your eyes. In a world where evil exists, neutrality or indifference is not a virtue, it is a betrayal. Today, Buchenwald still stands on Ettersburg Hill like a scar that never heals. And the city of Weimar remains below, beautiful yet always carrying a somber haunting. The story of the 1,000 citizens who marched up the hill that day remains a stern reminder that the boundary between a civilized human and an accomplice to the devil is sometimes separated only by a gaze. Will you look directly at the truth, or will you turn away to protect your own false peace? History opened Weimar's eyes at a terrible cost, and through them, General Patton forced the world to open its eyes as well. The story of the March of Shame at Buchenwald is not only a brutal chapter in World War II history but also a definitive moral verdict on human indifference. In terms of historical significance, General Patton's actions and Eisenhower's vision established a vital precedent for the preservation of criminal evidence. Eisenhower understood that truth is easily distorted. By forcing the Germans to witness the atrocities firsthand and documenting what they saw, he stripped future Holocaust deniers of their opportunity to rewrite history. This act transformed the truth from dry figures in a report into a visceral, lived experience, forcing an entire nation to confront the dark legacy they had helped create. Regarding life lessons, the story leaves us with three profound messages. Silence is complicity. The most painful lesson from Weimar is that evil is committed not only by those who pull the trigger but also by those who choose to look away. The indifference of the elite did not make them innocent, on the contrary, it was the nutrient that nourished the devil. In any society, when we remain silent in the face of wrongdoing to preserve our personal peace, we indirectly become a link in the machinery of evil. Culture does not guarantee humanity. Weimar proves that no matter how highly educated, art-loving, or sophisticated people may be, they can still become cruel if they lack a core conscience. Civilization is but a fragile veneer. Without empathy and moral responsibility, those cultural values are nothing more than a disgusting irony in the face of human suffering. Responsibility toward the truth. We cannot claim innocence simply because we closed our eyes. It is the responsibility of every individual to be aware and to speak out against reality. The truth is always present, regardless of our attempts to shroud it in excuses like, "I didn't know." Facing the truth, even when it is painful enough to break one's spirit, is the only way to truly cleanse the soul and prevent history from repeating its darkest pages. Ultimately, this story serves as a reminder: the scars of history are found not in the crematoria, but in the hearts that once grew cold to the breath of death right next door.